The information shared in this podcast and related media is intended to provide broad consumer understanding and knowledge of healthcare topics as they pertain to remote work. All content herein is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Further, this information should not be used in place of a visit, call, consultation, or advice of your physician or other healthcare provider. The owners of this content do not recommend the self-management of health problems. Should you have any healthcare-related questions, please call or see your physician or other healthcare provider promptly. You should never disregard medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen or heard on this podcast or read in related media. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor, seek professional help, or call 911 immediately.
Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast Mental Health Series. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. The purpose of this series is to destigmatize the mental health issues commonly found in the remote work community. We have partnered with doctors, therapists, counselors, and other mental health professionals for a series of in-depth discussions on a broad range of topics, ranging from isolation and depression to crafting meaningful relationships with others, and maybe more importantly, with ourselves. Our guest experts will share their insights in order to arm teams and leaders with the tools they need to thrive now and in the future. Mental health has always been a relevant issue for remote workers, freelancers, and distributed teams. But in today's climate, the subject is becoming more and more pertinent each and every day. I look forward to sharing this valuable information with you, and please join the conversation online, on the socials, or wherever the audience most suited to hear it can get involved. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by TeamMadeApart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free Best Practices Guide. Today's special guest is Jesse Giunta Rafeh. Jesse is a psychotherapist and certified success coach responsible for helping hundreds of people who feel lost find clarity and direction in their lives. As a teen, she struggled with anxiety, depression, and chronic self-doubt. But through her own emotional journey, she developed the tools and methodologies that have helped to empower her clients. She is motivated by the transformation she sees her clients achieve through their own dedication, self-discovery, and strength. Here to talk about relationship issues, working with and through anxiety, depression, transitions, and other issues as they pertain to the emotional health of remote teams, join me in welcoming to the show, Jesse Giunta Rafeh. Hey Jesse, welcome to the show. How are you? I am so grateful for you taking the time to do this, and just thrilled to death. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Of course. So let's just kind of start at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and some of your background information, so that our listeners can understand who you are and why we're talking.
Good. So I'm Jesse. I've been practicing as a psychotherapist and success coach for the last 15 years-ish. And my passion comes because I had a rough time when I was a teenager. I went to some helpers that didn't know how to help me. And then I found the one that really changed my life. And not only did I figure out how to get myself into a good emotional place where I was living a happy and fulfilling life, but I also realized I had a huge passion for helping others. I am a psychology nerd. I that's what I like to do for my job, but that's what I like to read for fun too. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, yeah, no, like I said, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, a big part of working remotely and, trying to, I guess, even just sort of be human, whether you're working remote or whatever, is overcoming a lot of sort of mental health challenges. And you have some interesting perspectives on a number of things that I'd like to get into. So maybe we'll just kind of dive right into that. So first things first, one of the things that I found most interesting about you was this idea of 5 steps to maximizing motivation. I think for a lot of remote workers, it's a prerequisite that you're almost, that you need to be self-driven and that you need to be able to sort of do a lot of things on your own and be motivated to work. And for now, in these sort of COVID times, we're in a situation where a lot of people have been forced into remote who maybe didn't want to work remote or didn't have a passion for being remote. And so I think that, finding motivation, not just in work, but also in life, and how do we, ultimately find happiness and success and everything in life. I think this structure that you have, or this framework, is really valuable. So do you mind talking a little bit about these 5 steps, and then maybe we can dig in a little bit on each?
Yeah, so let's start with step 1, which is get clear. So, and that we think as human beings that we know what we want, and it's just automatic. We want to make this amount of money. We want this kind of romantic relationship. We want to hit these goals at work. But honestly, all our wants and desires come from 2 places, because I believe all of us have 2 selves. One is our true self. That is actually who we are. It's the person that when we're feeling unconditional love, when we're doing something we're passionate about doing, we're completely in the moment. We're driven, we're in flow. This is our soul, this is us. And so that's one part. And when we make goals from that part, they happen, and they happen easily because we're inspired and motivated to do it. The other part of us that we all have is sometimes what I call the ego, or the negative mind. And that's the part of us that's our survival instinct. So even though we're human beings, and most of us listening to this podcast have our basic needs met: food, clothing, shelter, water, some relationships, our mind hasn't caught up to know that. It's still the animal part of us that's living in the jungle, trying to keep us alive. And the best way to keep us alive isn't to keep us in touch with these fulfilling true self goals. The best way to keep us alive is to keep us on a survival track, which would mean gathering the most resources, having the most money, having the most power, and making sure that nobody else hurts us. And so we often, so the first thing we got to do is we got to write down all our goals and figure out which ones really inspire me, which ones make me feel alive inside, I'm motivated to take steps right now, and which ones do I feel like I have to do this in order to feel okay, or in order for other people to see who I am. So that's step 1.
Yeah, so I'd like to maybe dig a little bit deeper and maybe just sort of understand definitions a little bit. So, this idea of the true self, and maybe I'm exposing my own neuroses here when I'm talking about this stuff, but I feel like, me personally, I have a really hard time getting in touch with that true self, whatever that is. I think that a lot of times I am wildly influenced by the people around me and the things around me. I get really excited about people's ideas and really get into things. And sometimes, even if it's not necessarily my idea or my driver, I can build up a state of attention to it where I think it's the right thing to be doing, and easily become distracted. And so I wonder if you could maybe just sort of dig in a little bit more on uncovering that true self. And if you have any maybe techniques on how you might find that. I think you alluded to one with the idea of, writing down some goals and uncovering which ones kind of give you the warm fuzzies. But I think one of the issues that I run into, even sitting down and writing goals, I have a really hard time, I guess, just managing clarity, or sort of looking far enough ahead to understand what it is I really want. And then, how are my goals being influenced by the people around me?
Yeah, great question. Because I think we're going to go through all the steps, but honestly, I could write an entire book about step 1, because it's kind of the key. It's 80% of the pie is knowing what you actually want. When we know it, it's not so hard to do the other things and to take action and to get in momentum. But knowing what we want is the hardest. So I'm glad you're digging deeper. I mean, part of the way I do it is I look around for the times in my life that I feel the most calm, the most centered, and then I go like, what am I doing? For me, like sometimes that's being in nature. Sometimes that's having a connecting conversation with someone. Sometimes that's I like to cook. So there's a difference that I can feel between that space where I'm not worried about what other people are thinking or where I'm trying to get to. It's a space that I sit and I just feel like me, I guess, is a way to say it. So I'm giving you more abstract kind of stuff, but I guess it's just allowing yourself to really spend the time to reflect and when do you feel most connected to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of these things that I've explored a little bit, just sort of, in myself as I try and really identify what is me versus what is, being influenced by Instagram or whatever. And it is really funny, because I'm asking you for techniques, but the reality is it is those moments. It's observation. It's recognizing,
Yes.
or sort of seeing patterns in yourself, understanding when you're doing something that you're less comfortable with versus something that just comes very naturally and easy.
Yeah.
So it's not really a technique. Like there isn't a shot you can give me or a pill you could hand over or something that's going to just make me suddenly see my true self. I think so much of it really is just about paying attention and understanding.
That's right. That's 100% right. And I was thinking, like, as you're talking, so one thing you can do if you're like, I don't know, I have no idea where to start with that, is you could go around and ask the people that you love, like, what do you think my strengths are? When do you see me being the most myself? Because I think our strengths are a good place to kind of gauge what our zone is.
Well,
another thing is, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Another thing is meditating, because meditating forces you to sit still, even if you're for 5 minutes a day, sitting still and allowing yourself to breathe and connect to the moment. It allows maybe some thoughts or inspiration to come forward that wouldn't if you're moving too quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and how much of this do you think, or how much of the problem do you think is this sort of pressure that we feel to be ourselves? So for example, like we act a certain way at work, or we act a certain way at home, or we behave a certain way based on social pressures and things like this. But how much of that do you think is really just in our own head? Like, so we're sort of putting this pressure on ourselves to act or behave a certain way because I don't know, the 26-year-old teen, person on Instagram has a yacht and I don't have a yacht. So, should I kind of act as if, and so I'm imposing this pressure, but it's all going on in here. It doesn't have that much to do with that person or their yacht or their situation or whatever. And so I'm wondering how much of this uncovering of the true self is being obscured by this, sort of self-imposed pressure, or like the time we're spending in our own head instead of just observing our natural behaviors.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, because all that external pressure about having the yacht or more social status or being liked, it's all survival instinct. The best way not to die in the jungle was to make sure your tribe accepted you. You were in a position of power. You were getting fed the good meat. You were strong enough not to get eaten by other animals. And so now, our mind is still looking around for how to go up in status and money and material things and popularity, and that blinds us to what we actually want, because it's not what we actually need in the modern day. Our environment has out-evolved our mind. So I kind of think of it as like throughout the day, if your true self was the moon and the negative mind was the sun, like at different times, the sun is eclipsing the moon and vice versa. So sometimes in the best moments, you're 100% in your true self. And in the worst, you can't even see what it is. And so our goal, or my goal when helping my clients and for me personally, is how can I maximize spending the most time there by being able to recognize when the stuff you're talking about is triggering me to not look at me, but to connect to acquiring safety, basically, and power.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. Well, and I think that's a good way to sort of think about it. Sort of this ego is the other half of this idea of getting clear, but it's sort of the opposite side of the coin. It's maybe the stuff that's taking you out, and I mean, I have a very rudimentary understanding of what the ego is, at least in psychological terms. But in my mind, it's basically the part of your brain or the part of your thought process that kind of gets in the way of you being able to see things, because either it's bloated and you're full of yourself, or it's or that might be how it manifests itself, or maybe it's in some behavior that you're doing to live up to some standard that somebody else has set for you or something. Like these are the things that seem driven by ego, where this uncovering of true self is sort of the opposite.
Yes, that's exactly right. Like you pointed to something else good, which is that the ego, like how we protect ourselves is we're constantly evaluating whether we're better or worse than everybody else. So some people, when they feel scared that they're not going to get their needs met, their defense, their ego starts to tell them that they're better than everyone else. That's why we hear the common thing, like if someone's putting you down, it's because they don't really feel good about themselves inside. I think that's completely true. I think when you actually feel good, there's no need to be evaluating yourself based on anybody else, and you don't need to feel better than anybody else. And honestly, that's just a made up system. Like we're all equal. We all have different strengths, different weaknesses, different opportunities, all of that. And so that's how it works. Better than if you're in a comparing state, it's a good key that you're in your negative mind or your ego. Okay.
No, I think that's great advice, because I was going to actually ask, what percentage or what part of our time, when is comparison valuable, I guess? So for people who are maybe trying to become a high achiever, for example, if you're trying to, model behavior after somebody or something like that, maybe comparison makes sense. Maybe not in a vanity version, the guy with the Lamborghini versus me and my Toyota Corolla or whatever. But, so maybe it doesn't make sense to get too caught up in comparison at that point. But do you think there's any value to sort of at least, and maybe it isn't comparison, maybe it's got a different name or a different way of thinking about it, but is there, something to this idea of, because I mean, I guess this is where like mentorship falls and stuff like that. You're trying to learn from others in hopes of, I guess, sort of elevating yourself. So, I mean, how much do you think, comparison could actually be a valuable part of a person's growth?
I think so. There is a huge value to surrounding yourself with people that have qualities or have achieved things that you want to achieve. So I'm a big believer, like who you surround yourself with, you start to emulate. So if you're, when I wanted to be like a really talented therapist, I went out and had lunch with a bunch of therapists that inspired me, who had built their own businesses, who were further ahead. Because if we can see someone else achieve what we want to achieve, it makes it more doable. The whole trick is to when that's a good thing and when that's not a good thing, to me, is when you're feeling inspired versus when you're using it to feel less than. Like you're looking at if we go back to the person on Instagram, you're looking at that person and feeling like less of a person, versus I'm looking at this person and going like, that's really cool. Like if that's possible for them, that's possible for me too. So. Okay.
Yeah, I like that.
It's and less of a comparison, more inspiration is the word. Okay. You want to keep going.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's maybe a more clear way of saying it. So moving on in this 5-step process, your second step is this idea of uncovering blocks and trying to determine the things that are in your way. And, I've thought a lot about how to sort of articulate these things. And there's actually one topic that if it sort of comes up, I'll broach with you, just because I haven't been able to figure it out. Maybe somebody smarter than me knows. But we talk a lot about roadblocks and things like that, the things that are getting in our way. And I typically attribute it to fear, which is kind of a maybe simplistic approach. But typically I sort of say the things that are keeping us from, finding success or taking the job we want or speaking up when we know we should, are probably wrapped around fear or some sort of deep-seated something. And so I wonder if you would talk a little bit about uncovering some of these blocks, and you break it down into a few different categories here.
Yeah, great. So I I don't think it's an oversimplification to say fear. I'm like, fear to me is the root of why we don't get what we want. If we were going to boil it down to one thing, it always comes down to fear. So I think that's a good way to look at it. And so I think a lot of times how these blocks come up is maybe there's something that I want to achieve or something that's inspiring to me, but I can't see it because my belief in myself doesn't believe that I can actually have it, which then is blocking me from even being able to see that I want it. I've already talked myself out of it because I don't believe I can get it. And I think most blocks are different variations on that concept. That's the simplest way to say it. And then you can kind of pay attention to, all of us have negative thoughts in our heads, but our negative thoughts content is different depending on who we are, what our individual insecurities are. So it's good to pay attention to what are the negative things that come up over and over and over for you, and to write those down, and those are probably your blocks.
Okay, and maybe this, maybe that's a little bit of a description of how to start doing this. But I wanted to ask you about limiting beliefs and sort of overcoming those. You touched on those briefly.
Yes.
But it's one of these phrases that I'm hearing more frequently now, is this idea of limiting beliefs. And in its most base form, or the way that I understand it, these are basically the things like you described. It's, oh well, he has that, but I could never do that. Or I could, oh, that person's, I don't know, speaking on stage or something, but I could never do that.
Yes.
And so nobody's actually putting that on me. That's something I'm creating in my own head. And so Can you talk a little bit about, limiting beliefs, but also maybe how to overcome them? And I think you just gave one tip there about maybe writing them down, sort of exploring them. But I wonder if you have anything else on limiting beliefs.
Limiting beliefs. So it's kind of what I just said. Some of the most common ones are, I'm not smart enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not good enough. They often were formed so where they come from is that when we were a kid, we are not capable of meeting our needs by ourselves, particularly our emotional ones. And so we're dependent on our parents to do that, or our caregivers. But our caregivers aren't perfect either, because they're human beings. So they're going to make mistakes, and not always, there's no parent that meets their child's every emotional need. It's not possible. So when the parent doesn't meet the child's emotional need, the child has two choices. One, they can say, it's their fault. My parents aren't perfect, so they're not going to be able to meet all my needs. But that's really scary, because now the world is unpredictable and they don't know what needs are going to get met and what aren't. Or the second choice is to go, it's my fault, and if I adjust my behavior, then all my needs are going to be met. So 99.9% of the time, unless you're severely, severely abused, like kids pick, it's all my fault. So when they go, it's all my fault, a parent doesn't meet the need, then they start to establish beliefs about their identity that they're now going to carry into their adulthood, unless we figure out what they are and rewrite it. Because it starts as adaptive to go, like, if I was a little bit smarter, my need would get met. And now I'm 25 and I'm not going after the career I want because I still think I'm not smart enough, which was really just some program I was using because I was scared my parents weren't going to meet my needs.
Yeah. So do you think that behavior is something that could be fed by an employer for a remote worker, for example? So if you're busy working, for a company or maybe as an independent contractor or something, freelancer, and you're spending a lot of time by yourself, maybe working for a company, but if your employer isn't maybe cognizant of this idea that they are now kind of, I don't know, have become your parent in one way of thinking, that maybe they might be somewhat responsible for the emotional needs of you, their employee. Do you think that this kind of the behavior patterns that we develop as a young person to try and cope with these, unknowns and things like that, do you think that could then be perpetuated by an employer who's maybe not totally on board with this, or maybe just doesn't have an understanding of that as sort of a base problem in human beings?
Yes, I think it can be perpetuated, and I also think it can be healed. Like our relationships, that's what's beautiful about becoming adults, is we're not just thrown into whoever our parents were from the get-go. Now we have our employers, we have our romantic partners, we have our friends, we have our co-workers, and that interaction, especially authority figure to someone less than, to someone, I don't know, I can't get the word, but like someone, the employee to the employer with a power dynamic can often, you're right, emulate a parent-child relationship. And if an employer is not figuring out how to communicate to their employee in a way that's going to inspire them, build them up, motivate them, then that can backfire on the productivity of work and cause conflict. And on the opposite end, if they do figure out, oh, this person, this is what they need to feel inspired, motivated, productive, can get more out of their employees than they ever thought possible. I really believe that it's an underutilized part of companies right now, not having more therapists, nor more people in there figuring out how to get the best out of everyone, because I believe everybody wants to do their best. Everybody wants to be inspired, but people don't know how to have access to it, and we could help them, and that would help everyone. That would help the entire system.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great observation, because I think it's true. And you are seeing sort of the winds of change a little bit,
Yes.
Companies are starting to make more progress towards this. And I think generally speaking, every year you're hearing more and more reports, and more companies appear to be coming online as it pertains to this kind of stuff. But I think there's still a lot of room to grow and a lot of room to improve. I mean, they've got a business to run, right? They can't spend all day becoming therapists themselves. But I think just being cognizant or being aware that, these are the struggles of a human, even in their own, even in themselves, I think will help them be more empathetic and maybe, become
and creative, because I was like, we look at when people, I'm not a parent yet, but I work with a lot of parents, and they look at the good ones, look at the individual needs of their kids, and then adjust their strategy for how to get them to be the best they can be given on their specific personality, instead of applying a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that's a great thing for bosses to be looking at.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. That's a good metaphor, actually. Just thinking about my own life, I have a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old, but they could not be more different. One is like raising an old cat, and the other one is like raising, 9 wild kittens or something,
Yes.
And so, I mean, they're totally different. And so the strategies we have to take in parenting them are completely different, right? One has needs that are more emotional and more sensitive, and the other, just needs help, getting down stuff or whatever, because he's going to do it on his own, that
yes.
kind of thing. So that's a great observation. Another roadblock that sometimes people get into, and I think this one's especially apropos, using the idea of the social media, experience that we're all enduring now, or whatever, looking at Instagram or whatever, and sort of being envious of people, is this idea of linear thinking. I think so many of us, can easily get trapped in these timelines where we think everything is step after step after step after step, and then you're just successful. That's just how it works.
Yes.
And I know for myself, I struggled with this a little bit, and it started hitting me in the last couple of years. The closer I got to 40, it started hitting me. And I started having a lot of regret about the way that I had been, running my life, and why am I not more successful? Why are we not making more money? Blah, 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 all these things, right? And holding myself to some standard. And I landed on this thought, and I'm sure somebody else coined it, and I just saw it somewhere or whatever, but I sort of have adopted it now. But it's this idea that it's basically taken every step I've ever taken to get to where I am today. And so for good or for bad or whatever, but in order for me to sit down and have this interview, it required 40 years of decision making. I didn't just come up with this a week ago. It took 39 years and a week to get there, that kind of thing. And that sort of helped me, I guess, cope with or put into a frame that makes me feel better about my life's choices. I don't now second guess, going on tour with the band when I was 21. Now that was a great choice, because had I not done that, I wouldn't have been working out of the back of a tour bus and learning remote work skills as a young kid. And so, so now I can put that all in perspective and feel good about it. But so I wonder if you could just sort of talk a little bit about this idea of linear thinking, and the example you use, or that I read on your website, was sort of this idea that Bill Gates didn't know what he was going to be. I mean, he was just a computer programmer. He's just kind of a nerd working in his garage and doing his thing. And it ended up well, but, he couldn't have gotten there if he just assumed that it was going to be this straight path.
Yes. So I think a lot of times we think, we have these bigger goals, and then we want to lay out like how it's going to happen. We're going to go from A to B to C to D to E. And like all the successful people that I've met and read biographies on, it didn't work. It didn't go A to B to C. One of the podcasts I love is How I Built This, with these people who are, like the founder of Whole Foods, the founder of Patagonia. And when you listen to the story of how they created these giant dreams for themselves, they were over here, the guy at Whole Foods was over here growing some vegetables and thought more people in the community needed organic vegetables. He didn't go like, and then I'm going to start with organic vegetables, and then I'm going to start this store, and then I'm going to sell this many, because he was following his inspiration. So I think it's about it's good to get clear about what you want 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 1 year from now, 1 month from now. But after you've done that and you've set steps that you're inspired to do to move towards it, trust the process. Trust that and it doesn't even matter if your 10-year goal changes either, because that's what I see too. Like sometimes people are like, this is the be all end all, and they start to take steps towards that and they follow their inspiration and they end up someplace completely different, which is twice as fulfilling and more interesting and more fitted to their personality. But if they were inflexible, they were just like, I'm just following this plan and I'm not going to veer from it, they wouldn't have seen it, the doors opening in other places.
Well, it's one of the things that, people point out a lot, and, especially now in sort of this social media generation that we're living in right now, it's really easy to look at a photo of a person on Instagram and compress their whole life into that photo, right?
Yes.
I mean, you're not being logical. You're not thinking, okay, everybody's only showing their best moments and all this stuff. And sure, there's your occasional trust fund kid with the Bentley or whatever. I imagine that happens on there too. But largely speaking, there's a backstory, right? Like somebody's put in 20 years somewhere, or somebody's, done exactly what you've described. They've done this zigzag pathway or whatever, and maybe they have the Bentley now, but you're not even looking at the last 20 years of their life. You just see this one little snapshot. And so
that's right.
And so I think that what you point out is really great. This idea of sort of, I guess recognizing that or trusting the process, and I guess giving yourself some latitude and understanding that it's okay to wiggle around, and you can set a goal, but if you don't get to it, that's okay. Like, don't not shoot for it, but don't not allow other opportunities or other things to step in, because you just never know. You could never be so intelligent as to plan out what's going to happen between now and 10 years from now.
That's 100%. That's 100% right. Like I had a thought, but I lost it.
Well, so maybe while we wait, and we'll see if it comes back to you.
Yeah.
I wanted to proceed down this thing too, because sort of the last roadblock thing that you mentioned in your top 5 here is this idea of the do it by myself mentality, and this one may not apply as much to like a remote worker working for a company, for example, who's just an employee of an organization.
That's right.
But for the freelancers and the independent contractors and stuff like that, the really small business owners, these guys get caught up in this kind of mentality all the time. And I know it because I do the same thing. Sometimes we get to thinking, and for a long time, maybe we are sort of the center of our own universe. And so it's really hard at some point to then get out of my way and start, letting teammates help me out or have other people step in and help me out. And I've become much better at this over the years, but I still see it happening a lot. A lot of people really struggle with this. So do you mind talking a little bit about just sort of what it is, the how to have to do it by myself mentality, and then just sort of maybe how we can work past it?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, like I wrote about it because I was one of them, that I'm gonna be able to control. I'm going to start my own business as a therapist in my own office, and I'm going to control all the aspects of it so that they're all done perfectly and nothing can go wrong, and I'm not wasting money and I'm not wasting time. But the thing is, then the only brain I'm using is mine, and we're actually, social beings, and other people spent time becoming experts in other fields that could help me. And as I expanded myself to including somebody to teach me about marketing, somebody to teach me about this different theory of practicing therapy, someone to teach me about how they do their bookkeeping. It doesn't matter what it is. Then my business grew. It became more efficient. I got more inspired. I wanted to do more work. So I think it's easy to think I'm just going to control every little aspect. And you meet some people and they give you advice and you follow it and it's no good. But that's part of the process too, that everything doesn't have to be perfect. And it kind of connects to the linear thing where it doesn't have to go from A to B to C. We can follow this. If we're inspired to do that, that feels good, and learn something new. And we grow a lot faster, personally and professionally.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And it's funny because there's no shortage of people running around screaming about how tribal we are and how important it is that,
Yes.
Especially now during COVID, where everybody's been experiencing so much isolation, there's a lot of discussion about, oh, well, we're tribal people, we really need to be around our people and all that stuff. So it's kind of ironic that so many of us will sort of take this approach that it is just me versus the world. When, in order for our tribe to thrive, if we're using that as a metaphor, you've got to have your hunters, you've got to have your cookers, you've got to have your, you've got to have all these different jobs. Everybody's got to do these roles so that we can contribute to the common good of everyone. And so it's just kind of funny or kind of ironic to me that it's not, seen that way for a lot of us, especially starting small businesses and things. I think we've got other drivers. There's maybe some economic drivers that sort of push it a little bit. And, we don't want to, like you mentioned, waste money or waste time or any of these things, because our assets are finite and we have X number of dollars to spend on these things. And so I guess I understand where it comes from, but it is funny how we're so tribal in one respect. But then when it comes to our work, we can become very, self-centered or very,
especially here. Like, I think in America, like, what's beautiful is like, you can achieve anything and you can, and that's the message that's given. But I also think we're very individualistic, like, in terms of countries. So, so we kind of get that we need the community and that's coming in and we're saying stuff, but it's not integrated into our history yet.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because I think it's kind of, the metaphor I might use is, sort of like, just to keep it COVID. It's this idea, when everybody was suddenly doing the run on toilet paper, right? That's all about me, man. That's me. I got to get the toilet paper. That's for me, all the toilet paper I can have, not putting any thought towards everybody else who might also need toilet paper. It was how much could I hoard, but then as soon as all the toilet paper is gone, we're like, well, why isn't there more toilet paper? How come people are bringing toilet paper? We need, we need the community to bring toilet paper, yet, individually we all took the toilet paper. And so it's kind of funny because, we're just working against our own, best interests in some cases.
That's right.
So as we continue down this path of these 5 items, we've basically, set some guidelines around getting clear and understanding who we are and what we want. We've talked about some of the things that get in the way and stop us from reaching those things. But I think this next part is really critical and maybe sort of the crux of this whole thing. And it has to do with goal setting. We've alluded to it a little bit in these last, as we've been talking. But I think, a lot of people, and myself included, really struggle with goals. And, for me, if I don't achieve a goal, for me, that's the kind of thing that'll throw me into a negative tailspin, right? I will be like, oh, well, I wrote out all these goals and I just can never achieve anything. How come I'm not going to achieve anything? And so I wonder if you had some thoughts around goal setting and how to set goals that are actually achievable, to maybe stave off some of this negativity.
So I'm like a big believer in baby steps, because I think what happens is we get all inspired and excited and we have this big goal and then we're like, okay, and then we map out how we're going to do it. But the map we made is way, way too big of steps to start with, because we often think, well, maybe I have enough time to do these goals or enough motivation to do these goals. But what we're underestimating is, as we're growing, when we're going for goals, we're growing and we're going outside of our box and we're trying to change something about ourselves. And as you do that, you're going to go up against fear. So even though it might be a simple task, it has an emotional component. And if you underestimate the emotional component, then you won't, and you set the goal too big and then you don't do it, then you're in the cycle of beating yourself up and see, this is what I always do. I try to start and I never get anything done and I can't come. And then all the negative beliefs come up that we just addressed before. And now we're in that cycle. So I'm like, whatever it is, if you've set goals and then you like, they should be really specific, they should be time limited, and they should be small. And so, and then if you've set them and you get to week 1 and you haven't accomplished them, then that means you haven't set the right goal yet. You keep breaking it down to smaller and smaller steps until you 100% can accomplish it, because that's the most important thing, is that you say what you're going to do. Because the more times that you set the goal and don't achieve it, the more you're convincing yourself that you can't. So it's better to be able to do something really simple. And then my clients often go, but I'm never going to get there at this snail pace. But what happens is you take 10 micro steps and then you start to get a little bit of confidence, and then you can take a small step and then maybe a medium step. And it starts to build momentum and you can accomplish more and more and more, but you have to give yourself a long enough runway to build the self-esteem to match with where you want to go.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think I've heard, I don't know if this is exactly what you're describing, but I've heard of a process called chunking, which is basically this idea, taking something big and breaking it into much smaller pieces. And,
yes.
you know, it's interesting, like you always hear people, you know, we've set a bunch of goals and we didn't achieve our goals, but you don't often hear people saying, I didn't have enough goals. Like I blew through my goals and I don't have enough to do.
Yes.
And so I think, you know, that might be sort of the indicator, right? If you're trying to really balance, because I think a lot of us, especially freelancers and you know, even remote workers to a you know, big extent, might have a hard time gauging or understanding how much we're actually capable of doing in any given period of time. So we sort of set ourselves up to fail because we think we can do 10 things in a day, when really we can probably do 5 or 3, you know?
Yes.
And so I think this idea of chunking is really interesting, but I just had that thought when you mentioned the idea that, you know, by setting the goals too big, we sort of set ourselves up to fail. And this idea of breaking them down smaller, I think is really great, because like I struggle a lot with the specific and clear aspects of setting these up, you know, making sure, I mean, it's always, you know, I'm going to lose weight, but there is
yes.
no, you know, it's not broken down into something I can actually act on. And therefore I never actually know when I got there. And so it's, I think that's a really good observation.
And that you said something good too, which is that write it down, because I think a lot of times we're like, okay, I got it, I'm going to lose weight, for example, and it's abstract and it's not written down and there's no time. So the odds of you actually moving towards that are small, like all your blocks and all the stuff that's going to come up, and then you're going to forget even what you were trying to do. But if you're like, I'm going to lose 10 pounds in the next 3 months by, you know, exercising this many days a week and by adjusting this part of my diet, which feels doable, not like I'm completely deprived, and it's like, then you just have a much higher chance. And and when you forget, you can look at it, because our negative mind or our ego will come in and block us from even remembering what we're trying to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think we often just kind of can't get out of our own way. And I think that one of the things that's happened in sort of, you know, this technological era is this sort of instant gratification idea that everything must be done quickly. And therefore, if it's not done quickly, it's a fail, you know? And so like, you know, all of us are looking for a crash diet or something we can do to lose 20 pounds before we're going to the beach this weekend or whatever it is. But these, you know, rapid methods for doing just about anything, whether it's weight loss or you're trying to apply it to some other thing, you know, if you're trying to get a website out this week or something versus taking a month to build it out, you know, you're going to run into the same kind of problems where, you know, you're not going to achieve it. And then you're right, the ego and everything else will start coming up, and, you know, you'll start getting into a space where you're not even really capable of doing the work.
Yes.
So to kind of keep this moving, because we're going long on this and I love this, but I want to talk to you about a couple other things too. But I think that this next step, and I think we've talked about it a little bit, you can see how each of these steps are sort of building on one another. But the next category in this top 5 is discipline. And this is something that I've struggled with a lot in my life, is trying to, you know, become or develop sort of discipline. And I think for a lot of creative people especially, maybe our belief is, or maybe we're copping out a little bit, but we sort of get away with saying that, oh, well, we're disorganized. We're just, that's just kind of how we are. It's how the creative brain works. It's kind of that thing. And so I wonder if you'd talk just briefly about sort of discipline and developing discipline. And I think, some of the things we've discussed already probably contribute to this, good goal setting and some of these other things. But
yeah, so I think it's about figuring out the strategy that works for you. In order to create discipline, because one thing is to have something that you have to do every day or really close together. The more spaced out the activities that you have to do are, the harder it is to build discipline, because you're only putting your focus to the test. If you're only putting it to the test once a week, then that's a lot harder than if every day for 5 minutes you have to do something to work towards getting your goal. So even though it's shorter and maybe you're going to accomplish less, it's really, really useful to consistently be doing things. And artists love to go like, yeah, no, I'm not into that anymore, so I'm switching directions. So sometimes I make my artists on my caseload, I go, we're going to pick a goal for the next month and we're going to work towards accomplishing it, period. Even if in a week from now you're like, you realized it's not the goal, the most important part is that we go from beginning to end, so that when we get to the things that are really important, you have the confidence to know that you can complete the process. To me, that's actually the most valuable part about school in general. It's less the content that we're learning and more that there's a beginning, middle, and end, and you have to meet deadlines. And so like figuring out that skill is so sometimes a class is, if you're like, I'm not good at discipline, a class is a good way to get structure from the outside if you're not ready to give it to yourself yet.
Yeah, I like that. And, it's one of the things that, at least for me, I really advocate for the idea of routine and sort of, even now throughout COVID, like normalcy has been a big keyword for me, this idea of trying to maintain sort of normalcy as much as we can. Like, I get it. Maybe you've got to wear a mask outside now, so it's different, but I'm still doing the thing I did, right? So I'm still going to the store. I just now have to wear a mask or whatever it is. And so, and then in terms of sort of leading a somewhat disciplined life, for me, so much of it depends on having a good routine. I get up at the same time every day. I get cleaned up. I eat, ostensibly the same breakfast every day. I do, and for me, that really works. That keeps me on track. For other people, and I've talked to a lot of different people who have different views on this, and it's funny because they'll go, oh, well, structure is not that important to me. It's not something that critical. But, then you start hearing their story and it's like, well, but I get up around 11 and then I go and have coffee and then I'll go do this. And it's like, okay, so you have a structure. It's just different than mine. My structure starts at 6 a.m. Your structure starts at 11. But we're both kind of living our day in this way. And that's the way we ensure we get something done. So I think to your point about sort of repetition and just, doing things and getting from start to finish, I think, all those things contribute to having good discipline and being able to sort of work your way through these steps.
Yes.
So the last step, and the last of these 5 anyway, and this idea of maximizing your motivation is maybe, I don't know, it's the thing that I do the least, but I'm the most interested in. And I wonder if you just sort of talk about that is the idea of celebration. And sort of, I guess giving yourself a pat on the back when you do things well. And so I wonder if you just sort of elaborate a little bit on the idea of celebration as it pertains to this 5-step plan.
Yeah, it's really funny because I think this is actually the most important step, and you are not alone in that. It is the most uncomfortable, the most dismissed, the least energy goes into it, because we're like, yeah, but I want to get here. That's our survival instinct again, trying to push us forward, make sure we're in momentum. And the fear is that for a lot of people, is that if we stop and go, yay, you did it, that somehow then that's going to cause you to be able to just stop working altogether and relax. But just like before, I talked about how not like setting goals, then not accomplishing them, and then having your negative belief about yourself about not accomplishing them puts you in a negative momentum cycle. Well, the celebrate step is about putting yourself in a positive momentum cycle. So you have the goal, you meet it, And then you make a big deal about the fact that you've met it. You go like, wow, I did that. And sometimes that can just be talking to yourself about that. Sometimes that can be setting up rewards for yourself. Sometimes that could be telling your friends and having them cheer you on. But the more that we're able to acknowledge that we're moving towards our goals and getting where we want to go, and that we're empowered, inspired to do that, and that we believe in ourselves, like then the easier it is to keep moving forward. If you go into a classroom and you ask kids a question in elementary school, like all of their hands will shoot up and go, pick me. And why? Because they're all craving getting externally validated. And when they do, that gives them a boost of self-esteem, makes them feel smarter, and then makes them want to continue answering questions and learning and moving towards their goals. And when we grow up, the beauty is we can give it to ourselves. And when we do, we become much more powerful, much faster.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's really great. And yeah, I mean, for me, it's like a self-esteem thing. I would never try and drive that much attention towards myself. But, I say that, but then I do little things, right? Like I'll run over to Starbucks and grab a coffee or something if I complete my project, or whatever. And so, it's funny, I'll do little low key versions of that myself. But I love that idea of just taking the moment and being proud for what you've accomplished. I mean, so many of us, it is on to the next thing, or it's, I've got 5 more tasks. Like this is just one, who cares, move on, but I do think it's important to take that little moment and acknowledge, yes, I put in the work, I got through it. I think that's really critical. So in these last 10 minutes or so, we've spent most of this conversation sort of talking about a lot of internal things and a lot of, just to tie it back to this overarching idea of relationships, we've spent most of the hour talking about relationships with ourselves. And yes. I think we've gotten to a really good spot, but I want to just shift that a little bit and talk a little bit about how all these skills sort of now can manifest themselves in the relationships we form with other people. So whether it's work-related, professional partners or professional relationships, or, even, in our social lives or whatever, it seems like having overcome these 5 steps, that are sort of designed for motivation will actually put us in a much better situation to be a good partner, whether it's in a whatever kind of relationship. And so I wondered if you just sort of talk about, development of human relationships and how we start to, and I understand this is a huge topic, so we'll kind of narrow the scope a little bit, but how getting, comfortable and I guess thoroughly understanding or practicing what we're talking about when we talk about these 5 steps, and then sort of applying those skills or the skills that we might have pulled out of that into and applying them into relationships. Does that make sense? Kind of like, trying to figure out how we, because I think there's... I got it. Okay. So the big thing is, the reason I talk so much about your relationship with yourself is because the stronger that becomes, the easier it is to do the relationships with everyone else. Because the things that go wrong in the relationships with everyone else is we feel attacked or misunderstood or disrespected, and if the degree to which that affects us depends on how strong and stable we feel in our own core. So if I'm feeling confident and smart and productive, then when someone speaks to me in a way that's triggering or condescending, I'm much more likely to look at them and go like, oh, maybe they're having a bad day, or and I'm much less likely to personalize it. So that's one of my huge keys of having successful relationships, particularly in the workplace, is I'm going to take as little personal as possible. I'm also going to go in, and I believe that people have good intentions in their heart. I believe that. Now, and their own negative mind, ego is going to get in the way of that. Their own fears might get in the way of that. But if I figure out how to get to their true self, it's going to be a good interaction. And the way I'm going to do that is by really seeing if I can stay loving, non-judgmental, accepting of the person in front of me, so that I can figure out how to bring the best part of them out. Yeah, no, and I think that that's a great point. Basically, this idea that in order for you to be a good partner to somebody else, whether it's in a romantic relationship or in an employee-employer type relationship or whatever, you do kind of have to do the work for yourself first. You've got to kind of get yourself right. It's the I guess if I was going to draw a metaphor, it's like on the airplane. You're supposed to give yourself the mask before you help somebody else, because the idea is you're no good to them dead. And so that kind of thing. And so I think it makes perfect sense for this too, as it pertains to relationship development, this idea that, your relationship with yourself needs to be okay. And, and then that does give you sort of this higher position or this opportunity to be able to be empathetic for the person who is, acting out or whatever. And I suppose in a workplace, especially, and especially among remote teams, you're overcoming so much, like geography, cultural differences, all kinds of things that you're overcoming. And I think if you jump right to everybody is trying to attack me or everybody is trying to make me feel a certain way, versus, oh, well, maybe where that person's located, this makes perfect sense. Or maybe what they really meant to say was this, but their English isn't that good. Or, maybe they're a poor email communicator, maybe they're much better in person. Or, there's a lot of those situations that, I guess if you're not quite right with yourself, it would be pretty easy to see those as attacks. And so it makes perfect sense to me that you need to sort of do that hard work up front. And I think that, I don't know, maybe that's a good place to sort of put a bow on this thing, because I think that that's a really critical moment and a really critical thing. And I think we did spend a lot of time talking about self, but now looking back at it, at the course of this conversation and hearing how we've sort of come to this conclusion, it seems, almost perfect to me. Like that seems like the right discussion to have had, because I just don't think we can do the rest of the work without uncovering this stuff.
I'm with you there. So feels good to me too.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and wrap this up then. Let's talk a little bit about just where people can find you, learn more about you. I know you have a book coming out soon, if you'd like to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So you can find me, in the normal places. Like if you look at, my name is it's Jesse Giunta Rafeh, but that's hard to know how to spell unless you actually look in the show notes. But if you find that name, it's unique enough to Google and find all my other stuff. But the big thing for me is that it's been a life goal of mine to write a book so that I could not only take the stuff that I use in session with my clients that I see impacts their lives in a positive way. Like, that is the most inspiring thing to me, to see people go after their goals and get the kind of life they want. And I wanted to be able to make what I've learned over the past 15 years of experience helping people, I wanted to make that accessible to everyone. And so I've written this book, and it's been awesome. It's called Life Launch, A Roadmap to an Extraordinary Adulthood. And it's for people in their 20s and 30s. And it's a practical life guide to create the kind of life you want, from every aspect, from your work life to your physical body to your emotional self and to your relationships. So
I think that's great. Well, thank you so much for the good work you're doing on that front. I'm bummed that I didn't have that book 20 years ago. It would have helped out a lot with some of the hurdles I've tried to overcome over the last few years. So thank you so much for doing that. And also thank you again just for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody who tuned in this week and every week, and we'll see you guys next time.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know you.